Giant sequoias, their whole reproduction, their whole life cycle is very strongly tied, not just to fire, but to moderate or higher intensity fire. Forests need fire to cycle nutrients and maintain their productivity.
This is The Butterfly Effect, a podcast that shows the big impact a small action can do. Tali Orad is talking to those special people that make a difference with nature and trees.
Welcome everyone to The Butterfly Effect. My name is Tali Orad. I'm your host and your butterfly here. Today my special guest is Chad Hanson, a forest and fire ecologist with more than 17 years experience in this field. His Ph.D. research focused on forest and fire ecology and the rare wildlife species that depend upon post-fire habitat in forests in the Sierra Nevada and elsewhere in western U.S. He has published an impressive list of scientific research papers on forest and fire ecology, wildlife use of burned forest, natural post-fire forest regeneration, and fire history and trends. Welcome, Chad, to The Butterfly Effect. I am thrilled to have you on the show so you can shed some light on the importance of wildfires.
Thank you.
I would like for us to start from the beginning. You are a forest and fire ecologist. The term fire ecologist means the science of understanding natural and human fire history and the fire effects on the environment, species, ecosystem, and landscape.
Exactly. My research focus during my doctoral dissertation and ever since then is on forest and fire history in forests, and also how forests naturally regenerate after natural disturbance processes like fire, and different wildlife species, native species that have evolved over millennia to be associated with and actually depend on post-fire habitat, especially areas where fire kills most or all the trees, areas that we used to think were destroyed or were lost to wildlife habitat. It turns out that's actually some of the very best and most biodiverse habitat in the entire forest.
That is fascinating.
And increasingly, I also study the relationship between forest protection and climate change mitigation, because we need our forests, in addition to moving beyond fossil fuels, we need to increase protection of our forests to overcome the climate crisis, because we have to draw down the atmospheric carbon.
Between 2011 and 2020, 10.8 million acres of forest burned, 3.2 million acres or even more just in 2020. And this is only California. The last 10 years have shattered records of forest fires, while 2020 tops them all.
Yep.
Why are the numbers so high, Chad? I mean, it's not new to see fires in California. Obviously not during the summer and end of summer and fall. But this is different. Why?
There's a couple of things that are happening. We are having fire years in California right now that are bigger than fire years in recent decades. But it's really important to understand these are actually not record fire years. We had significantly larger fire years before fire suppression policies a century ago. And I think that that's really key for people to understand. We had a weird period of time in the middle of the 20th century and through the 1970s and early 1980s. There's a natural climate fluctuation called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. It goes on for multiple decades, and sometimes it's in a cool phase when there's less fire, and sometimes it's in a warm phase where there's more fire. During the middle 20th century, that's when industrial fire suppression was really gearing up. And it just happened to coincide with that cool phase of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And what that meant was, for a combination of factors, we had very little fire, relatively speaking, for a few decades there. Now, we shifted to a warm phase of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation right around the time that climate change from human activities was having an increasing effect every year. And that combination means we have a lot more significant and even higher extreme fire weather than we had decades ago. The key lessons from this is weather and climate are in control here. That's what's driving fires predominantly. It's weather and climate variables, and therefore also climate change. And so the current focus of state and federal land management agencies and the current focus of Congress on trying to do more and more vegetation management, as they call it, or active management out in the forests, that is misguided, because what it's fundamentally doing is ignoring and denying current climate science, which is telling us it's mostly the climate that's driving fires. And in fact, the more logging and vegetation management that's done, it doesn't stop fires. And typically fires will burn through those areas even faster and hotter than if nothing was done to those areas. And I think what it all means is we need to pull back, focus on protecting human communities from wildland fire, creating climate adapted, fire safe communities, and protecting our wildlands so that they can absorb more CO2 from the atmosphere and store more carbon.
Right. And how do you see that happening?
We're going to need to change state and federal laws. Right now, our policies are really more like 19th century policies, and we're trying to shoehorn them into a 21st century world.
Right.
And it's causing all kinds of problems. And unfortunately and tragically, homes are being lost. Entire towns are being lost. People are dying because we're doing things the wrong way.
Why do you think that is?
There's a series of myths and misconceptions about wildland fire that are actually getting in the way of making progress on climate change mitigation, and they're getting in the way of making progress on protecting communities from wildland fire and saving homes and lives. And one of those myths is that we actually have too much fire in our forests. But it's universally understood in my field among scientists that we have less fire in our forests in almost every region than we did historically. And the only thing we really debate is how much less we have. We do have too much fire in some ecosystems in California, like chaparral, but that's overwhelmingly because of human ignitions in low elevation areas, foothill and valley communities adjacent to chaparral. There's just a lot of population centers, and there's people doing things that accidentally or sometimes deliberately cause ignitions. That's a human problem that we can control. And of course, that coincides with climate change as well when you get those hot, dry, windy conditions.
Right.
But the bottom line is that we had 4 million acres burning historically on average in California in the 1800s before fire suppression. And so it's important to understand that because fire is not destroying these ecosystems. They're very resilient to fire and very adapted to fire, and they regenerate quickly after fire. And actually, fire helps them maintain their carbon. The problem is right now we have a lot of human communities in the way, and we need to focus on protecting them.
I see. So if I try to sum up what you just said, it's that fires are, or at least natural wildfires, are important to the life cycle of healthy forests. And also that those big fires that we see right now it's a cycle. So it's not the first time that it happens, and it's probably not going to be the last time that it happens. Unfortunately, we have humans in the way, or not unfortunately, I guess it's a fact. And there is climate change, but we need to find a better way to prevent those not necessarily relevant fires, or I don't know how to define it differently. Am I correct? Is that what you were trying to describe?
I think that captures it pretty well. I'd say in terms of prevention, the way I would phrase it is we need to prevent the losses and impacts that we're seeing in human communities. That's where the catastrophes are. We hear the phrase catastrophic wildfire all the time in the public dialogue, but people don't really know what they mean when they say that. And I think what we need to do is completely decouple the conversation about what it means ecologically for fire to occur in our forest ecosystems and other fire adapted communities where we don't have too much fire, where we often have too little fire, versus what it means for fire in a human community where you have the potential for loss of lives and homes. And that's where the catastrophe is. If homes are lost, if lives are lost, that's always a catastrophe. But the good news is that's largely preventable. We have good science on this, and we know that if we focus on homes and protecting communities and lives, that the vast majority of homes can be saved in a wildland fire, and the vast majority of lives can be saved as well. And we can also, if we focus on communities, prevent most of those unplanned human ignitions, those accidental, deliberate arson ignitions, or power line ignitions. We can prevent most of that if we focus there and focus appropriately. While we can let fire be fire out in the more remote wildlands, because it happens that a lot of wildlife species, they can't survive without post-fire habitat. They need those areas where fire kills most or all the trees.
Right.
That's actually some of the very best habitat in the forest. And so we have to have two totally separate conversations about fire in the forest versus fire in communities.
Okay, so let's start with the fires in community, because it seems like there are, at least down your sleeve, there are a few tips you can share with everybody that is listening on what they can do to prevent fires in the community.
It's really about preventing homes from burning, and it's about making sure that people and their animals can safely evacuate. Or if they can't evacuate because a fire just happens too close by, that they can safely shelter in the community. And so, first of all, the home itself. we need to focus on making homes much more fireproof. And that comes down to fire-resistant roofing. There's still some homes, especially in rural areas, which are often next to wildlands, where they have those old cedar shake roofs, and that's incredibly combustible.
Mm-hmm.
So those need to be replaced. Things like dry pine needles and leaves accumulating on a roof in places, that has to be swept off every fire season, sometimes twice a fire season. Rain gutter guards. People oftentimes don't realize that most homes that burn in wildland fires never come in contact with the flames themselves. Fires are driven mostly by weather and climate, as I mentioned. And so these are wind-driven fires, and there are flaming embers that are driven by the winds, thrown by the winds, far in advance of the flames, sometimes a mile or two or more. So thousands of these flaming embers will rain down on a community before the fire gets there. And that's what's causing most of the ignitions. And so an ember will land on a roof, it'll roll down into a rain gutter, and if it doesn't have a gutter guard, it might land in 4-inch deep dry pine needles or dry leaves and cause an ignition, and then the roof catches on fire and the house burns down. Another one is exterior vents, especially attic spaces. A lot of homes have old vents where an ember can just float or fly right through it. And if people spend $300 or $400 and install modern ember-proof vents, many homes would survive fires. And then, of course, there's defensible space. And really what that means is pruning vegetation within 100 feet, mostly the first 60 feet around each individual house. And you have to do that every year. And if those things are done, the great majority of homes will survive.
Mm-hmm.
And we have numerous examples of that. Beyond 100 feet from any individual home, the science is telling us that vegetation management, whether it's removing chaparral or logging or other vegetation management, it has no additional benefit to home protection. So it really is more of a less is more situation.
Right.
You got to concentrate right at the home in the immediate vicinity. A lot of that's preventable, but it's not going to be prevented by doing more logging out in the forest. In fact, that often makes fires burn hotter and faster toward towns.
It's obviously counterintuitive, and always I hear people saying, even the U.S. Forest Service is talking about clear-cut logging after fires and doing all of that. And then you saying, actually, it's not good. Why is that?
Yeah, a lot of the things in my field are counterintuitive, but once you understand them, they make sense. So the first thing to understand is that trees, whether they're live or dead, in forests are largely non-combustible. It's really important to understand this because it is only a very small percentage of trees that actually gets consumed in a fire, and therefore only a small percentage that contributes to the fire intensity and the fire spread. So for live trees, in a typical, even in a large fire, only about 2 or 3% of the biomass in the trees is actually consumed of live trees. And so you're talking about the outer surface of the bark, just a superficial layer. You're talking about sometimes small, some twigs and needles. And that's it. And usually not even the twigs and needles. Usually it's just, the surface, some of the surface of the bark. Mm-hmm. Very, very small trees like saplings, can get mostly consumed or entirely. But most of the biomass in the trees is in trees several inches in diameter or much larger. And so it's really important to understand that, because most of the logging that's happening right now is being done under the guise, deceptively, of fuel reduction. But about 97, 98% of the wood that they're removing from the forest is in the form of mature trees. And in other words, about 97 or 98% of what they're removing under the banner of fuel reduction, so-called, is actually literally non-combustible in a wildland fire. And so there's a disconnect there. For dead trees, the consumption's a little higher, depending on how old and how decayed they are.
So they will not burn easily.
That's the key thing to understand, is that most of what they're removing from the forest under the guise of fuel reduction and fire management is actually not combustible. Now, what happens is, after they log, what they leave behind is highly combustible. The twigs, the small branches that they can't remove, even if they try, on the forest floor, kindling-like material. In addition, logging spreads highly combustible invasive grasses like cheatgrass, and it forms dense mats, sometimes 2 feet tall, across the forest after logging. And fire can sweep through that extremely rapidly. Nothing burns faster than a grass fire. And really what logging is doing largely is turning these forests, partially or wholly, in many cases, into grasslands.
Right.
And in addition, when it comes to things like what the Forest Service, for example, and the logging industry call thinning, Most people think pruning shears when they hear that term, but thinning projects are industrial logging projects, and typically 60-70% of the trees will be killed and removed, including many mature and old growth trees. And what that does is it reduces the cooling shade of the forest canopy cover, and it creates hotter and drier conditions on the ground that are more conducive to fire. It also spreads those invasive combustible grasses. But in addition,
makes it easier.
Exactly. And it also reduces the kind of windbreak or wind buffer effect that a denser forest has. And so the winds that drive the flames can sweep through the forest much more rapidly, oftentimes toward towns. And that's what we saw in the campfire. There was a lot of logging, removal of dead trees under the guise of fuel reduction, thinning, and that's what the campfire burned through fastest before devastating paradise.
Are there any trees that are more flammable versus more resistant than others? I'll tell you why I'm asking. As I understand, the giant sequoia lacks the ability to sprout after fires. And on the other hand, they are more susceptible to fires. And then yet we saw in the recent fires that they were actually burned. And that made me think, okay, maybe there are trees that are more resistant, and yet they were burned. Then that's why I was thinking, could be a tree that is more resistant to the flames, yet what happened this time?
Right. Yeah. So there are trees that are more resistant. Actually, giant sequoias are one of the most fire-resistant tree species on the planet. They have a very thick bark that insulates them against the flames.
Mm-hmm.
And they're very tall. And so they often tower above the rest of the forest. And so even if the flames are very tall and kill most of the other trees in that particular area, the giant sequoias will typically survive. And that's what we've seen in the recent fires that have burned through giant sequoia groves. And the same thing with the coast redwoods. The great majority of the sequoias and the coast redwoods survive. They're very fire resistant. And interestingly, giant sequoias, they don't sprout after fire. What they do have is what we call serotinous cones. And all that means is their pine cones need fire that's pretty intense in order to melt the resins in the cones and release the seeds. And fire also has to be intense enough to consume most or nearly all of the duff and litter, the little twigs and pine needles and fragments of pine needles on the forest floor. So you get this really nutrient-rich bed of mineral ash, and that allows germination. It basically allows reproduction. And so giant sequoias, their whole reproduction, their whole life cycle is very strongly tied, not just to fire, but to moderate or higher intensity fire. And that does kill some giant sequoias, especially the smaller ones, but most survive. But they need that in order to reproduce and flourish and survive into the future. And what we've been doing for many decades now, about a century, is sort of loving our giant sequoia groves to death. We've been keeping fire out. We've been excluding fire. And what they really need is more mixed intensity wildland fires. And the places where that's happened recently, the giant sequoia groves are absolutely thriving.
You shifted our discussion to positive, which I like, which shows that there is a renewal of a forest after fire. And I'm just curious, is this why wildfire are such a key component to the renewal of the forest?
Yes, we've had fire in our forests around the globe for over 300 million years. And you have plant and animal species that have evolved over millions and millions of years to adapt to fire or even depend on fire and the unique types of habitat that it creates. Forests need fire to cycle nutrients and maintain their productivity. If they don't get fire for too long, if too many centuries go by and they don't get a significant fire, then they become less productive and the nutrients become less available. And so you need fire for the biodiversity. You need fire to maintain the forests and the forest carbon storage. You don't want too much, certainly. You also don't want too little. In the forests around the world, people don't realize that we actually have too little fire. And so we shouldn't think about fires being an ecological tragedy or something that we need to try to marshal our resources to try to prevent with all kinds of misguided and counterproductive measures. And the same thing goes with patches of dead trees from drought cycles. Those areas are incredibly biodiverse. There's so many wildlife species that depend on that. And in fact, most wildlife species, especially bird species, will increase in those areas where there's a lot more dead trees. We actually don't have too much of that habitat now. And we really need to focus on communities.
And leave the forest to regenerate itself.
Absolutely.
You mentioned your research, the Blackbacked Woodpecker. What did you learn on that study?
Well, a few things. I've done a number of studies on blackback woodpeckers, just summing them all up. Really what we've learned is This is a species that has evolved for about the last 3 million years in the forests of North America to depend not just on post-fire habitat, but on areas of very dense, mature, and old forest that burn at high intensity across large areas in large patches. So one pair of blackback woodpeckers needs about 200 or 300 acres of dense, mature conifer forest where fire has killed most or all the trees. And of course, they'll share that habitat with a lot of other species, but not so much with other woodpeckers. At the edges, they'll share with other woodpecker species, but they'll defend the core of their territory very, very fiercely. And the reason for that is this. Those areas where fire kills most or all the trees, that's actually where the most food is for wildlife and where the best homes are. And so it's like a wildlife bonanza. And I'll just explain that.
Yes, please.
When a fire occurs in the forest, there are dozens of species, native species of beetles called wood-boring beetles, and they're really big. And they have evolved over millennia to depend on recently fire-killed trees to reproduce. These beetles have evolved receptors in their bodies to detect the heat or the fire from smoke from miles away. And they'll make a beeline for a fire area. And they fly towards the fires. And so they arrive, shortly after the flames have passed and the fire-killed trees have cooled. They will land on the charred bark of a fire-killed tree. They'll lay their eggs, and their larvae develop and bore through the bark into the wood of the tree. And they develop there over time into adults and emerge a year or more later and fly away and find the next fire. But while they're in that larval stage, while the larvae are in the fire-killed trees, these standing dead trees that we call snags, that's the primary food source for these woodpeckers. And these woodpeckers have evolved adaptations to be able to strike really hard and get through the bark of the tree and get these grubs. So one blackback woodpecker, for example, needs about 13,500 wood-boring beetle larvae every single year to have enough food to survive. And of course, they need food for their young every year. And so you need a lot of fire-killed trees to support that. Now, these woodpeckers, they excavate between 2 and 4 new nest cavities every single year. The male will primarily excavate the nest cavities. The female will help sometimes. And then every spring, she'll pick the one she likes the best, and that's the one they use. And that's where they'll raise their young. But all the other nest cavities that are created, those are available to all the other cavity nesting species in the forest that have to have cavities to reproduce and raise their young, but they can't create their own. Chipmunks, bluebirds, nuthatches, flying squirrels, dozens and dozens of bird and small mammal species in the forest. And so they need the woodpeckers to survive and reproduce. The woodpeckers need the wood-boring beetles, and the wood-boring beetles need natural disturbance processes like fire and drought to kill trees and patches of trees.
Yeah, the circle of life.
At the same time, when fire occurs, it spurs and stimulates the growth of many different native shrubs and understory plants. And most of these are flowering plants. And that provides excellent habitat for small mammals, for shrub nesting birds, and it's great for a lot of native flying insects because of all the flowering plants. And that provides food for fly-catching birds and bats. And in turn, all this other wildlife and richness and biodiversity provides food for hawks and owls, various raptors that need those small mammals and also smaller birds for their food. And so what you have is a rich and complex and interconnected ecosystem. But the cornerstone of it is dead trees and the beetles that depend on them.
That is fascinating. How long does it take for the forest to rejuvenate?
It starts just weeks after the flames have passed. Mostly you'll start seeing it in the first spring in the year following the fire. You'll see new shoots coming up to the ground. You'll see new conifer seedlings, poking up through the soil and the bed of ash. You'll see the wildflowers, and the woodpeckers will start moving in. Over the course of the next 4 or 5 years, the native shrubs start to mature, and then you get the wood warblers and other shrub nesting birds.
Right.
And then different woodpecker species will come in sometimes at 7 or 8 years after the fire, and they'll stay for longer. A lot of the fly-catching birds will start showing up at 5 or 6 years after the fire. And mostly the main time period for snag forest habitat, we also call it complex early seral forest, this unique forest habitat type that's created where natural processes, fire or drought, kill most or all the trees. It usually lasts for about 30 years. And of course, you get all the new young trees, conifers and oaks and others, that regenerate after the overstory trees are killed initially. And those start to grow up. And after a certain time, after some decades pass, they get larger and And now you've got sort of a mid-successional forest, and it's no longer snag forest habitat. The dead trees fall in time. The larger ones take some decades to fall. Once you get the new stand of forest growing in with enough trees and enough size, they start shading out those shrubs that need high sunlight. They start shading out a lot of the species, plants that comprise snag forest habitat, and they start dying back. And now you've got a forest that's growing, back into a mature forest again. And it may not be another 200 or 300 years until a fire of sufficient intensity comes and creates another patch of snag forest habitat.
Right. We obviously don't have a few decades. Is there a way we can help expedite the process?
The best thing we can do is protect a whole lot more forests from logging. We really need to reduce our wood consumption nationally and globally. We need to turn to non-wood alternatives for building materials, for paper, and we need to end the hundreds of millions of dollars, the billions of dollars of logging subsidies at state and federal levels that are perpetuating this rampant logging that we see in this country and also around the world, and redirect those resources into forest protection and also into green jobs programs to help create fire-safe communities and help communities become more climate adapted.
Yeah, I hear you, but it's not enough. We don't have much time.
Well, I think we need to understand that forests naturally regenerate after natural disturbance processes. Even in the largest high-intensity fire patches, in the biggest fires, research, including my own research, is showing that these forests naturally regenerate just wonderfully, even if there's no live surviving tree within 300 or 400 yards, which is unusual, by the way. Usually there's surviving trees much closer by. But even in those rare circumstances where there's not a tree nearby, the birds and squirrels will distribute seed source all over the forest, and trees naturally regenerate. And so we actually don't need to plant trees on public lands after fires or other natural processes. And in fact, on public lands, even though planting trees seems like a good idea on its surface, it's actually what it's really doing is facilitating clear cutting, because the vast majority of the funds that are dedicated for reforestation on national forests and other federal lands in the United States are actually for planting trees after clear cutting. And a lot of that is post-fire clear cutting. They clear cut an area, and when they do that, they kill, by the way, with the logging machinery, they kill nearly all of the natural forest regeneration. They crush the conifer seedlings that are growing in, for free, courtesy of nature. They'll clear cut the trees in the forest and remove all that ecologically important snag forest habitat, send most of that carbon into the atmosphere, and then they plant trees. And so, ironically, even though the intentions are good, a lot of lawmakers right now who are promoting bills or funding for more reforestation on federal lands, they don't realize that what they're actually promoting is deforestation and conversion of natural forests to sterile tree plantation. They're more like crops and are not forests and don't store much carbon and have a lot of invasive species in them.
So what do you think we should do? What does science say we should do?
What the climate science is telling us is that the most important thing we can do for forests, for climate change mitigation and biodiversity, number one, is to protect existing forests, whether they're carbon-rich old-growth forests or whether they're younger forests that have been degraded by past logging. Those younger forests oftentimes are far below their natural carbon storage potential because of logging. And if we protect them, they can play a huge role in climate change mitigation.
How about areas that were cleared for agriculture?
Best way to recover forests there, native forests that grow the best and are best for biodiversity and store the most carbon, is actually to passively recover forests. Just protect those areas, get the agricultural practices out of those areas, and allow them to naturally regenerate, which the forests will. But there are some places where nature needs a helping hand, where vast areas have been cleared of forest, where planting native tree species is a good idea. But I would say that's the exception, not the rule. And we always need to be mindful that, especially in certain places like federal lands in the United States.
So at 1 trillion, we are giving that helping hand. We are planting the trees where agricultural areas needs the extra help. And you're trying to preserve the current forests. It seems like this is not enough.
There's a strong consensus forming in the scientific community. And there was a letter from over 200 top climate scientists and ecologists that was sent to Congress earlier this year that made this key point, which is that the science is telling us that we cannot overcome the climate crisis only by moving away from fossil fuels. That's necessary, but it's not sufficient, not anymore.
Right.
We have to also dramatically increase protection of natural habitats, especially carbon-rich habitats like forests and wetlands, in order to draw down the dangerously high levels of atmospheric carbon. Because the reality is, once we put the carbon up there through human activities, through fossil fuel burning and through logging, it stays up there for a very, very, very long time. It comes down extremely slowly. Even if we move away from fossil fuels very quickly, we will not avoid the worst and most catastrophic impacts of climate change unless we also protect our forests, especially nationally and globally. And we do more logging in the US than any other country around the world, including Brazil. We are the nation's biggest culprit in terms of carbon emissions from logging. In this country, in the US, annual carbon emissions from logging are higher than the residential and commercial sectors combined in this country. And so, logging is a huge source of carbon emissions, exacerbating climate change. And we have to not only turn the corner on that and start reducing our wood consumption and protecting our forests on public lands, also increasing protection on private lands and more acquisition and conservation easements. But we also have to serve as a global model. And since we're the biggest global culprit, we have a responsibility to set an example so we can encourage other countries around the world that have a lot of forests to increase protection of their forests for biodiversity and climate change mitigation, and also for the rights of indigenous communities.
Mm-hmm.
But in order to do that and not be seen as a global hypocrite, we have to do better here.
I'm with you. I'm with you with the preservation of the forests, and I'm with you with everything else. And crossing my fingers we'll be able to do it, because we only have this planet to live in. All our talks about Mars and Venus, it's far in the distance. There's only one planet.
Yes.
Do you have a favorite tree?
Sugar pine is one of my favorite tree species. It's hard not to love the giant sequoias too.
Thank you, Chad, for this fascinating and enlightening discussion.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We are all beautiful butterflies, each in his and her individual ways. I wanted to thank you for joining me today in this episode. I really appreciate you coming on this journey with me, and I hope to see you next time. And remember, it only takes a small action to make a big difference. Be a butterfly.
And that's all for this episode. Thank you for joining us today. Please subscribe to hear more of our stories of change.